1942. Banks of the Don River, western front of the Stalingrad sector. The Don River lay still that night, an endless ribbon of black glass cutting through the Russian steppe. No moon, no wind, only the slow whisper of current against mud and the soft clink of metal from somewhere in the dark. On the near bank, shapes moved, hundreds of them, men hunched under the weight of silence and fear. They were soldiers of the 63rd Army, newly formed and raw, part of the Stalingrad front. Their boots sank into the wet soil. Their breath clouded faintly in the August air. It was 20th August 1942, and the order was simple, if not suicidal. Cross the Don before dawn, unseen. For hours they'd waited, breath held, cigarettes forbidden, even whispers silenced by a raised hand. Across the water, unseen in the darkness, were German sentries, men of the 6th Army, dug into comfortable positions, convinced the Soviets wouldn't dare attack at night. The river was their natural wall. The Germans had no reason to expect ghosts, but the Soviets were about to prove that ghosts existed. The command post sat beneath a low embankment. A single lantern glowed faintly under a torn canvas. Around it, Colonel Andrei Belyakov, commander of a rifle regiment, leaned over a hand-drawn map. The paper was damp, corners curling. He spoke quietly to his engineers. No lights beyond this point. No orders shouted. You see a flare? You turn back. If they hear us, we're finished. One of the sappers, a boy no older than 20, nodded, swallowing hard. The engineers had spent 2 nights fashioning rafts from oil drums, timber planks, and even barn doors stolen from nearby farms. Some of the boats leaked before they even touched the river. But there was no time for perfection. The crossing had to happen tonight or never. Somewhere behind them, the rumble of distant artillery rolled like distant thunder. That was the sound of Stalingrad, far to the south, where the German advance pressed toward the Volga. The men knew that if they failed here, those guns would grow louder, closer, unstoppable. A signal flare arced faintly in the far distance, not near them, but enough to make every head turn. Then, a moment later, silence again. A frog croaked from the reeds. Someone muttered a prayer under his breath. Another spat into the mud for luck. Midnight struck. The first raft slid into the water. The men pushed it gently, bodies half submerged, rifles held above their heads. The current caught them, twisting the raft downstream. A rope line stretched taut, then went slack. Someone hissed a curse. The silence was so fragile that even the slap of water sounded like betrayal. Across the river, German machine gun posts remained quiet. No lights, no alarms. The plan was working. For now, they crossed in waves, each platoon ghosting behind the one before it. No talking, no coughing. Only the rhythmic sound of water and boots, the faint creak of wood. One man slipped. The splash was loud as an explosion to those waiting on the shore. They froze, but nothing came. No gunfire, no shouts. The night held its breath. Colonel Belyakov stepped onto his own raft last. He carried no weapon, only a field map sealed in wax and a compass. A junior officer beside him whispered, "Sir, we should wait until the first group signals." Belyakov shook his head. "No, we go now. The river doesn't wait." He was right. The Don was wide, more than 200 meters at this bend, and deceptive. The current was stronger midstream, pulling the flimsy rafts sideways, downstream towards sandbars invisible in the dark. The men paddled with pieces of plank, rifles, even helmets. The river was cold enough to sting the skin raw. Halfway across, a breeze lifted the mist, revealing the far bank faintly, a darker line against a dark world. There were shapes, trees, perhaps trenches, but no movement, no muzzle flashes. The Germans slept, or believed the night too sacred for battle. Then, from the far shore, a voice hissed across the water, barely audible. "T. Slishish? Do you hear that?" Two men froze mid-stroke. A German patrol, perhaps. Drunk, drowsy, suspicious. They waited. Seconds stretched like hours. Nothing followed. The river swallowed the echo. When the first Soviet soldiers reached the far bank, they collapsed in the reeds, faces slick with river water and fear. A sergeant whispered, "We're through." Another corrected him, "No, now we hold." Behind them, more rafts followed, carrying mortars, light machine guns, and crates of ammunition wrapped in tarpaulin. The sappers returned again and again, ferrying men like silent ferrymen between worlds. Life and death, separated by a river's width. Before dawn, 3 battalions had crossed undetected. They fanned out along a narrow strip of marshy land, forming a bridgehead no larger than a football field. The men dug shallow foxholes, with helmets, too exhausted to feel their hands. Belyakov stood among them, soaked to the waist. He looked eastward, to where the faintest gray light touched the horizon. Then he looked west, to the enemy. The German lines were still quiet. Smoke rose from their morning fires. They had no idea. "Comrades," he whispered to his adjutant, "we are ghosts now." And with that, the first silent victory of the Don crossing began, a phantom army moving through fog and current, unseen, unannounced, rewriting the map before the enemy even woke. But what they had built in darkness now had to survive the light. What awaited them when the sun rose would test the courage that brought them here. The crossing wasn't a single act. It was a feat of invention. If courage carried the soldiers across, ingenuity made it possible. 2 nights before the operation, the Soviet engineers had been handed a near impossible order: build enough transport for 2 divisions, without bridges, without engines, without alerting the enemy. The Germans watched every road by day, so the Soviets worked only at night, under tarps, by touch and memory. Logs were dragged from the nearby forest to cut silently with muffled saws. Barrels were scavenged from abandoned collective farms. Rope was twisted from telephone wire. Every sound risked detection. Every spark of light could mean death. The sappers joked bitterly that they weren't engineers. They were ghosts crafting ghosts. Lieutenant Viktor Sokolov, head of a sapper platoon, kept a small notebook. In it, he wrote, "If we build them fast, they'll sink. If we build them slow, they'll see us. So we build them right the first time, in the dark." They tested each raft in shallow water. If it drifted straight, they marked it with chalk. If it listed or leaked, it was patched with bark, straw, even torn greatcoats soaked in tar. The smell of resin mixed with sweat. The men's hands bled from splinters. Still they worked because dawn meant exposure, and exposure meant artillery. When the order came to move the rafts to the launch site, the engineers did it by hand, dragging them through marsh and mud, step by step. Horses would have been faster, but too loud. The only sounds were the grunt of effort and the steady breathing of men who had stopped feeling fear hours ago. As they reached the riverbank, the current glimmered faintly, reflecting distant lightning. It wasn't a storm. It was artillery far down the front, near Kletskaya. Every rumble was both cover and reminder. Time was running out. Sokolov inspected the ropes. each line leading from raft to raft like veins connecting a body. One wrong knot, one broken line, and a platoon could vanish downstream. He knew it had happened before on smaller crossings. The river takes men faster than bullets, his mentor had once told him. When the signal came, 3 faint taps on a metal canteen, the first raft slid into the black water. It held 8 men and 2 machine guns. They paddled with oars carved from shovel handles. The current bit immediately, spinning them sideways. A private cursed. Sokolov whispered, "Keep her straight. Feel the pull. Don't fight it. Flow with it." He wasn't just an engineer now. He was a helmsman, a lifeline. Behind them, teams prepared ferries, larger constructions meant to carry mortars and light anti-tank guns. These were nothing more than barrels lashed together under wooden platforms, yet somehow they held. The men trusted physics because there was nothing else left to trust. All the while, runners relayed messages back to headquarters. No fire detected. Enemy patrol quiet. Crossing continues. Each message carried across the bank by whispered code. Then disaster nearly struck. One of the ferries drifted off course, colliding with another. Wood splintered. A crate of mortar shells slid into the water with a heavy splash. For a moment, everyone froze. Then, silence again. No alarms. Luck or fate, or perhaps the sheer weight of darkness, had saved them. By 3 a.m., more than 1,500 men had crossed. The engineers, many now waist-deep in mud, kept working, binding rope, pushing rafts, ferrying supplies. One of them laughed quietly, deliriously, saying, "If they ever see this, they won't believe it was us who built it." Another replied, "That's the point. They'll think we flew." Hours later, just before dawn, Sokolov's hands were shaking from cold. He stared at the water, at the faint shapes moving toward the opposite shore, and felt something between pride and disbelief. "We did it," he whispered. Then, under his breath, "Now may God help the men who crossed." Across the river, muffled gunfire began to echo, sporadic, uncertain. The Germans had finally noticed something. Not an army, not yet, but movement where there should have been none. The first light touched the horizon. Smoke drifted low over the river. The engineers watched, motionless, as the bridgehead came alive with return fire and shouted orders. Their work was done, but for many, it would also be their last. Somewhere upstream, Colonel Belyakov's radio crackled with a single phrase. Crossing complete, bridgehead secured. The Ghost Army had done the impossible. They had crossed a river the enemy thought uncrossable, under the very noses of men who believed themselves safe. But holding it? That was another kind of war entirely. And as daylight revealed their positions, the ghosts would have to become soldiers once more. By dawn, the sky had turned the color of wet steel. A pale mist crawled low across the river, veiling everything in an eerie half-light. The dawn, which had been silent and merciful through the night, now seemed to breathe, slow, heavy, ancient. And out of that gray breath came the Soviets, wet, shivering, mud-caked, and alive. The first to reach the far bank had waited in the reeds for nearly an hour, frozen and motionless. They didn't dare move until the rest of the wave arrived. Every minute stretched like a lifetime. The mosquitoes were unbearable. The water smelled of clay and rotting leaves. But none of that mattered. The men's eyes stayed fixed on the tree line, just beyond the bank, where somewhere, unseen, German sentries were supposed to be watching. Yet nothing moved. Not a voice, not a light. The Germans were sleeping. A young sergeant named Mikhail Baranov, leading the 2nd Platoon of the 197th Rifle Division, gripped his rifle tight. His orders were clear. Secure the ridge, clear the trenches, silence any outposts. Quietly, if possible. Quietly, he thought, half smiling to himself, as though that word had any meaning left in war. He gave the signal. 2 taps on the helmet. The platoon began crawling forward, bodies pressed low against the mud. Every step felt heavier than the last. The reeds whispered around them, masking their movement. Somewhere to the right, a frog splashed, and every man froze, breath held, fingers on triggers. Nothing followed. They moved again. Baranov could see the first German position now, a low dugout near a line of birch trees, half hidden behind sandbags. 2 helmets rested on a log. A small fire had burned out beside it. Whoever was there, if anyone, was asleep. The sergeant raised his hand. His men fanned out. He whispered, "Na raz, dva." On 3, they stormed forward. It lasted seconds. A startled cry, a muffled shot, then silence. One of the Germans fell before he could reach his weapon. The other stumbled into the open, eyes wide, shouting, "Alarm! Russen!" before a bayonet silenced him. The alarm never carried far. The mist swallowed it. By 5 a.m., several Soviet platoons had cleared a 300-meter stretch of the bank. The bridgehead was real now, a piece of land seized in blood and water. Men began marking positions with sticks and signal cloths for engineers to see from the opposite shore. Sappers started reinforcing the bank, driving stakes, laying planks for heavier equipment. The ghost army was solidifying into flesh. Colonel Belyakov crossed last. His uniform was soaked through, and his boots squelched with every step. When he reached the far bank, Baranov saluted him with a trembling hand. "Report, Comrade Sergeant. Enemy outpost neutralized. No reinforcements yet. We hold, for now." "Good," Belyakov said quietly, scanning the mist. "Then we dig." Every man understood the order. They didn't need shovels, helmets, bayonets, even their bare hands tore at the earth. The first foxholes appeared within minutes, shallow, desperate, but enough to hide a man. The soil was wet and heavy. They worked in silence, occasionally glancing toward the ridge. Then, from somewhere deeper inland, a dog barked. Once, twice, then silence again. The Germans were stirring. A runner arrived breathless from the shore. "Command reports second wave delayed," he said. "Current too strong, 1 ferry lost." Belyakov didn't flinch. "Then we hold with what we have," he said. "If the enemy wakes before dawn, they'll find us waiting." The waiting was the hardest part. Every sound, a twig snapping, a branch creaking, felt like the start of an ambush. But as the eastern sky lightened to gray, still no attack came. The Germans truly hadn't seen them. Baranov looked across the river, barely visible through mist. He could see faint shadows of movement. More men crossing, rafts returning. He wondered if the enemy would ever understand what was happening beneath their noses. A single German flare streaked into the sky far downriver, white, brilliant, hanging in the mist. Then another. Someone had noticed something somewhere. The Soviets froze. The light turned their faces ghostly. When it faded, silence again. But the illusion was broken. Time was running out. At 6 o'clock in the morning, the first German machine gun opened fire. The rounds cut through the reeds, hissing over the men's heads. The Soviets ducked low, firing back blindly. Muzzle flashes blinked like lightning in fog. A man near Baranov was hit. Throat open, no sound, just blood. The sergeant pressed him down, whispering, "Stay low, stay low," though the man was already still. The bridgehead erupted in chaos, not retreat, but instinct. Men crawled to firing positions. Mortars were assembled. Machine guns set up on hastily built tripods. Across the river, engineers scrambled to get heavier support ready, but the current was too strong now. The Don, faithful ally of the night, had turned traitor in daylight. Belyakov crouched behind a tree, speaking into his field radio. Static, then faint voices. "Tell them to bring artillery across," he said. "Anything that floats, I don't care. We can't lose the far bank now." As the sun finally rose, burning through the mist, the full sight emerged. Soviet troops spread along the far bank, thinly stretched, their positions crude but defiant, and the Germans, still disoriented, were only now beginning to respond. The crossing had succeeded. The ghosts had reached the other side. But the ghosts would soon have to fight like men of flesh and blood. And the river behind them, wide and merciless, was no longer a refuge. It was a trap. The dawn that revealed their victory also revealed their peril. The German sentries woke to gunfire, not distant, but near. Too near. At first, many believed it was a Soviet probing attack on the eastern bank. They'd grown used to small, desperate raids during the night. But when smoke began rising from their side of the river, confusion rippled through every forward post. At a command dugout near Kletskaya, Lieutenant Otto Hirsch rubbed his eyes and listened to the frantic chatter on the field phone. Reports overlapped, incoherent, contradictory. One outpost claimed they were under attack from ghosts coming out of the fog. Another insisted Soviet artillery had somehow crossed the river. Hirsch stepped outside, squinting toward the dawn haze. For a moment, he saw nothing. Then faintly, movement. Shadows in the mist. Dozens of them. Maybe hundreds. He blinked. "Mein Gott," he whispered, "they're already here." The 6th Army's left flank had been considered secure. The Don was wide and defended by minefields and river watch detachments. Command had believed any major crossing impossible without warning. But what had unfolded during the night defied German logic. A full Soviet regiment across the river before sunrise. Panic spread faster than the reports could be confirmed. Machine guns barked sporadically, firing at shapes that dissolved in fog. Mortar teams scrambled into position. Officers shouted orders they barely understood themselves. In the chaos, several companies opened fire on empty fields, burning through precious ammunition. Inside his bunker, Colonel Hans von Reichel, commanding the local defense sector, slammed a map onto the table. "Where did they cross?" he demanded. The staff officer stammered. We're not sure, Herr Oberst. The 63rd Army, perhaps. The river bend near Mityakinskaya, we think." Von Reichel's face paled. That was a weak point. Lightly held, with no reserve units for kilometers. "Then they'll cut us off," he said grimly. "If they hold that bank, we lose the corridor." Meanwhile, across the river, Soviet troops were already digging in, firing bursts to keep the enemy guessing. Their mortars sent shells arcing into German positions that hadn't even located the source yet. The sound of the explosions echoed across the valley, rolling like thunder, trapped in fog. Hirsch tried to rally his men. "Hold the ridge! The Russians are few!" he shouted. But as the mist cleared, he realized the truth. They were not few. Lines of Soviet infantry were visible now, spread along the low ground, moving methodically, using captured German trenches as their own. He saw one of them, a sergeant with a red scarf tied around his wrist, signaling others forward. Calm, disciplined. Not ghosts, not peasants, soldiers. For the Germans, it was a nightmare. The enemy not just attacking from across the river, but already among them. Back at Soviet command, General Mikhail Shumilov received the first confirmed reports. "Bridgehead secured," the message read. He allowed himself a rare smile. Months of planning, secrecy, and improvisation had paid off. But he knew what came next: counterattack. The Germans would not let this stand, and they didn't. By mid-morning, Stukas appeared, black silhouettes diving out of the sun. Their sirens howled over the river, sending shockwaves through both banks. Explosions tore the reeds. Men were thrown into the air like rag dolls. One bomb hit a ferry loaded with ammunition, turning it into a brief, blinding fireball. The dawn turned black with smoke and red with reflection. Still, the Soviets held, their rifles jammed with mud, their throats raw from shouting, but they held. A group of machine gunners, their Maxim gun propped on sandbags, fired until the barrel glowed red. When it overheated, they urinated on it, cursed, and kept firing. Across the ridge, Hirsch's men tried to counterattack, but every move drew fire from unseen Soviets. "They're everywhere!" someone shouted. Hirsch knew it wasn't true, but it felt true. The fog of war wasn't just weather, it was fear. By afternoon, the battle had devolved into chaos. Trenches traded hands, men fought at bayonet range. But the strategic outcome was already decided. The Soviets held a foothold across the Don. That small strip of land, born of darkness and silence, would soon become the staging ground for a far greater maneuver. The encirclement to come. When night fell again, the Germans counted their losses. The reports were grim. Enemy across river, position unknown. Bridgehead expanding, request reinforcements. Von Reichel read them in silence. The impossible had happened. He looked once more at the map, at the river line that had seemed invincible, and muttered, "They came like ghosts and stayed like men." What had begun as a whisper in the dark had turned into thunder, and the thunder was moving west. The day after the crossing began with rain, fine, misting rain that blurred the landscape into something dreamlike. The dawn was swollen and dark, its surface rippling under wind and shellfire. On both banks, men crouched in mud that never seemed to dry. The Soviets had done the impossible. They had crossed a river the Germans considered impassable. But now came the harder task: holding it. Colonel Belyakov hadn't slept in 2 days. His men were stretched thin, most of them soaked to the bone, their hands raw from digging trenches into sodden earth. The bridgehead they held was small, barely a kilometer deep and 3 wide. Yet it was a miracle that it existed at all. He looked at the line of men huddled behind their makeshift defenses and thought, if we survive till dusk, we might just make history. At first light, engineers began ferrying supplies across again. They used anything that could float: doors lashed to barrels, truck hoods, rafts made from oil drums. Ammunition boxes came first, then food, then mortar shells. Horses refused to enter the current, so they were led by rope, eyes covered with sacks. A few panicked halfway, drowning silently under the surface. Every crossing was a gamble. The Germans had begun to target the river with artillery, shelling at random intervals. The sound of incoming rounds echoed over the water, a low, mournful scream that ended in fountains of spray. Some ferries never reached the far bank, splintered, burning, sinking under men who clawed at air and current alike. But more kept coming. On the far side, Soviet sappers worked with grim focus. They had one mission: build a pontoon bridge before sunset. It was insanity. The river too deep, the banks too soft, the enemy too close. But they worked anyway. Men waist-deep in freezing water hammered stakes, fastened planks, and prayed the cables would hold. By noon, the outline of the first segment was visible, a fragile skeleton stretching across the gray expanse. Meanwhile, in the trenches of the bridgehead, Sergeant Baranov's platoon was living minute to minute. The air stank of damp wool and cordite. German artillery had found their range, and every few minutes another shell fell closer. The men no longer ducked. They simply pressed tighter to the earth, waiting for the next impact. Baranov crawled from foxhole to foxhole, checking his men. "Keep your heads low. Save your grenades. Wait till they come close," he said. His voice was hoarse. The men nodded silently, eyes sunken, lips cracked from thirst. There was no water left to drink. The dawn itself was a death trap. At 10:30 a.m., German infantry attacked. They came in gray waves through the reeds, shouting, rifles blazing. For a moment, it looked as if they would sweep the thin Soviet line into the river. Baranov grabbed a machine gun, fired until the belt ran dry, then threw grenades into the mist. When the smoke cleared, the reeds were filled with bodies. The attack broke. But Baranov had lost 4 men, 2 dead, 2 screaming for a medic who would never come. He looked toward the river and saw movement, reinforcements, finally. Dozens of small rafts, moving fast, men paddling furiously. Some were shot midstream, falling into the current. Others reached the far bank, stumbling out, weapons held high, faces young and pale. Among them were mortar crews, their tubes wrapped in cloth. Belyakov ran to meet them. "Welcome to the front," he said grimly. The newcomers didn't smile. They just started digging. The rest of the day was an endless loop of attack, rebuild, repeat. Each German assault came closer. Each Soviet counterfire grew weaker. But as the sun began to sink, the sound of hammering carried over the river. The pontoon bridge was nearing completion. For the first time, vehicles might cross. A single anti-tank gun was dragged across on planks before dark. It took 20 men and 2 hours. When it finally rolled into place, the soldiers around it cheered weakly. It was their first piece of armor on enemy soil. Night fell. Fires burned low, muffled under wet tarps. The men ate whatever they could: bread soaked in river water, tinned meat shared 3 ways. The air buzzed with mosquitoes and the faint hum of distant engines. Baranov lay in his trench, staring at the stars through mist. The world felt impossibly still. Then he heard it, a deep, rhythmic clanking from across the river. He sat up. "Listen," he whispered. It was unmistakable. Tanks. They were coming. Soviet engineers had done it. Under cover of night and smoke, the first light T-60 tank rolled across the fragile pontoon bridge, its treads thumping like a heartbeat. Men lined the bank, cheering despite themselves. One shouted, "Now we fight for real." Another crossed himself, whispering, "May the bridge hold." By dawn, 3 tanks had crossed. The bridge sagged, creaked, but survived. And with them came trucks loaded with ammunition and food, the lifeblood of the bridgehead. The ghosts of the night before were now an army. Belyakov stood watching the tanks disappear toward the ridge, their silhouettes black against the gray morning. He felt something he hadn't dared feel since the crossing began: hope. The river had tried to claim them. The Germans had tried to erase them. But the Soviets were still there, and now, finally, they were growing stronger. The Don was no longer just a barrier. It had become a wound torn open between two armies, and through that wound, the Red Army was beginning to bleed westward. They had crossed as ghosts. They now stood as conquerors of the impossible. August 7th, 1942. Banks of the Don River, western front of the Stalingrad sector. The snow came before the silence, a thick, smothering sheet that erased the noise of engines, boots, and even death. The Don River had long frozen over, its once murky current trapped beneath ice that glimmered like steel. The bridge the Soviets had fought so desperately to build was gone, dismantled. But the crossing had served its purpose. It had opened the door to Stalingrad. And now, that door was slamming shut. From north and south, two Soviet fronts, General Vatutin's and General Yeremenko's, were converging like the jaws of a trap. Between them, deep in the ruins of Stalingrad, the German Sixth Army stood unaware that history had already written its fate. The men of the Soviet Ghost Army, those who had survived the Don crossings months earlier, were among the units now advancing again, not as shadow raiders, but as avengers. They had been reborn through the river, and now carried its cold persistence within them. Colonel Belyakov, grayer, thinner, and walking with a limp from shrapnel in his thigh, commanded a column of tanks under the 5th Tank Army. His orders were clear. Cut the German supply lines west of Kalach, link up with Southern forces, and encircle Paulus's 6th Army. It sounded simple, but simplicity in war is a mask for chaos. The wind howled as they moved, a white blur swallowing landmarks. Visibility dropped to meters. Tanks became shadows. Infantry became whispers. Still, the column pushed forward, following frozen ruts and compass bearings through the storm. At dawn, Belyakov received a radio call. Southern front approaching from Kotelnikovo. Hold position near Sovetski. Link up expected within 24 hours. He smiled grimly. The same river that once divided them now bound them together. By nightfall, Soviet units from both fronts met near Kalach. The circle closed. Operation Uranus was complete. The German Sixth Army, nearly 300,000 men, was surrounded. For the first time since the war began, the myth of Nazi invincibility cracked. From the sky, reconnaissance planes reported columns of Germans attempting to retreat, only to find every road cut off. Frozen tanks lay abandoned. Horses collapsed from exhaustion, their bodies soon buried by snow. Entire battalions wandered aimlessly, waiting for supplies that would never come. Inside the pocket, General Friedrich Paulus clung to orders from Hitler. Hold Stalingrad, not one step back. But outside, the Soviets knew time was their ally. The river that once seemed impassable now served as their shield, freezing solid under the cold, a wall of ice against any rescue attempt. Barinov, now a captain, led his men in mop-up operations along the northern perimeter. They found pockets of resistance, small German platoons, desperate and starving. Some fought, some surrendered, some simply stared blankly at the snow as if it were endless. One night, after a firefight in a frozen ravine, Barinov found himself standing over a captured officer. The man's face was gaunt, his uniform filthy, his eyes hollow with disbelief. "Why are you still fighting?" Barinov asked, half out of pity, half out of confusion. The officer laughed bitterly. "Because someone told us we couldn't leave." The answer echoed for days. As the encirclement tightened, the battlefield transformed into a graveyard of machines. German convoys were shredded along the frozen steppe. Planes sent by Goering to resupply the army were shot down by Soviet fighters or forced to drop supplies miles from their targets. At the center of it all, Stalingrad itself still smoldered, a city reduced to skeletons of buildings and oceans of ice, where men fought for basements and burned for bricks. Belyakov's tank group reached the outskirts of the city by mid-December. From there, he could see the glow of fires still burning inside what had once been factories. The Volga froze in streaks of blood and ash. Radio intercepts confirmed what everyone suspected. The Germans were collapsing. Fuel was gone. Ammunition was scarce. Frostbite claimed more lives than bullets. And still, Paulus refused to surrender. In the trenches, Soviet soldiers no longer cheered. They had learned what victory meant. It was not the absence of death, but its endurance. On January 31st, 1943, Paulus finally capitulated. His surrender came not with a bang, but with the quiet sound of a pen scratching paper in the basement of a ruined department store. When the message reached the front lines, Belyakov stood motionless. Around him, his men shouted, embraced, cried. He did none of those things. He simply removed his cap and looked east, toward the river, where it had all begun. The dawn was frozen now, white and still, as if keeping watch over everything it had helped birth. A crossing, a victory, and the end of an empire's arrogance. That night, Baranov sat beside a campfire with the few survivors from his original platoon. They spoke little. When one soldier asked what they would do next, Baranov only said, "We bury them, then we march again." Because even now, the war was far from over. The encirclement at Stalingrad was not the end, only the turning of the tide. The ghost army that once crossed rivers in darkness had now crossed history itself. And in their wake, the ice whispered with the names of those who never came back, soldiers who had turned rivers into roads and cold into fire. Decades passed before the rivers thawed in memory. When the war ended, medals were given, statues were raised, and cities rebuilt. But the story of the ghost army, those nameless, faceless men who crossed the dawn in silence, faded into the margins of textbooks. Their bridge was never preserved. Their names, mostly, were never found. And yet, their legacy lived, not in marble, but in the silence that comes when people remember something too big for words. In 1962, an old man limped along the riverbank near Kalak. His name was Sergei Baranov. The hair was gone, the uniform long replaced by a factory coat. But the eyes were the same, gray and restless. He stood where the bridge had once stretched across the dawn. Nothing remained except a few rusted bolts and faint impressions in the earth. The river flowed gently, indifferent and eternal. He knelt, touching the soil. "You're still moving," he whispered, "still carrying them." Around him, the countryside was quiet, birds nesting in willows, the wind brushing through reeds. Children played nearby, their laughter echoing where once artillery had roared. For a moment, he felt the weight of both worlds, the living and the lost. Courage, he thought, was never the noise of victory. It was the choice to move when everything told you not to. It was the moment when men built bridges under fire, not knowing if they'd ever step onto the far bank alive. History would remember Stalingrad as the turning point, the fall of the Sixth Army, the triumph of Soviet will. But the crossing at the dawn was its heartbeat. Without it, there would have been no encirclement, no victory, no redemption. That night, Baranov sat by the water's edge, lighting a small candle. It flickered in the wind, its glow trembling on the river's surface like a memory refusing to die. Far away, in archives and dusty records, historians would later uncover fragments, after-action reports, letters, even sketches from engineers describing how the pontoon bridge was rebuilt again and again under shellfire. But none of those documents could capture the sound of it. The rhythm of hammers in the dark, the whisper of boots on planks, the sigh of the river bearing witness. Courage, duty, memory. 3 words that sound simple, but live heavy. For the soldiers of the Ghost Army, duty was not glory. It was repetition. Hammer, lift, carry, cross. Courage was not the absence of fear, but its mastery. Memory was not pride, but peace. The kind that comes only when you've seen the cost of survival. Baranov died in 1974. His grave lies near the river, marked by a small stone with a single word, most, bridge. Visitors still come there sometimes. Veterans, historians, grandchildren of men who crossed that night. They bring flowers, sometimes toy boats made of paper. They set them in the current and watch them drift away. No one speaks. The river does that for them. Because history, like water, remembers everything. The courage that built, the fear that froze, and the silence that followed. The Ghost Army had no anthem, no flag. Only the sound of the dawn beneath their feet, whispering through time. And if you stand there today, when the wind is right and the world is quiet, you can still hear it, faint and steady, like a heartbeat under ice, step by step across. The sound of men who never stopped moving forward.